Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me all right in the back there? I see some heads nodding. That's wonderful to see. My name is Shadish Kapoor. I'm the President and Vice-Chancellor of King's College London, and it is my great pleasure to introduce today's event, the inaugural COP28 Outcomes Summit. Now, this comes about as a collaboration between the Mission Zero Coalition, the Diplomat magazine, of course, King's College London, and our Policy Institute here, and it's kindly supported by Reckitt. Now, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers for you today, people who can provide insights into climate policy and the COP process. Now, I must say that I'm a bit of an observer of the COP process, and I've been watching the different media outlets as news was coming. And frankly, it depended upon which one you read. It almost seemed to you that there were two different summits going on, depending on what news item you read. And I think, therefore, it's very helpful to step back from that heat of the event and the glare of the media and take some time to reflect with thoughtful scholars, politicians who understand this along with the scientists as to what actually was achieved. Because nothing could quite be more important than climate and sustainability. As a university, it is of course very important to us, first because it's probably the most important thing on our students' minds. Now you might think that we come into this because of science, but we actually come into this because it is, when I ask my students what's their number one priority at the university, you think, well, they're here to come and get a job and secure their livelihoods. They're genuinely worried about the planet in a way that I must have to admit that as a student, to me, this was an interesting issue for the geologists and the geographers, but wasn't essential to every student's life. So as a university, I think it's very important for us to engage. The other thing that the university does is, of course, engage in research. And like most other universities, we've got many researchers who are engaging in this. But I think a particular privilege you have if you're King's College London, if you're located right here, walking distance from the Parliament of this great country, walking distance from the city, is the ability to convene. And therefore, I'm particularly thankful for the many people from outside of the university, your excellencies, the leading ambassadors of so many other countries who've decided to come today to listen and to share your view and reflect on COP29. This is important to us at King's because we think we have a special role in convening people to have this conversation. Following COP27, we were really very fortunate that John Kerry, who's the United States Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, came here in this very building to discuss the global climate action. And we were also delighted to host the launch of the independent review of UK's net zero promise by our very own Skidmore, who's here today. And we really had the pleasure of working closely with you, Skid, and Mission Zero to make this possible. But we as a university have also decided to take this seriously with appointing an assistant principal for climate and sustainability. You can imagine universities have always had assistant principals for education and for research and for international affairs, but we thought it was important enough that we as a university give it prominence, and I'm very pleased that one of the world's leading climate scientists, Professor Frans Berkhout, who's with us here today, is our assistant principal. But I think the most important role we can play with you is engage the public in this debate. Because it's all very well for the scientists and the scholars to agree on it, but unless we get the public to own this issue, change will be impossible. And this is something one of our first speakers know better than anyone else. The Right Honourable Lady Theresa May served as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 2016 to 2019, and enshrined in law a commitment to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050, making Britain the first major economy to do so. She has since continued to be a passionate advocate for action on climate change, and in your own words, you've recognized this as one of the greatest threats to civilization, and you've called upon UK to lead a green revolution. No one could be better positioned, therefore, to start off this afternoon and evening, and therefore it is a great pleasure to welcome the Right Honourable Lady Theresa May.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you, Professor Kapoor, for that introduction. And thank you also to King's College for co-hosting this summit today, for giving, as you have just said, an opportunity to reflect on COP28, an immediate reflection on COP28. I'd also like to talk a little bit about what has been achieved up to COP28 as well, in order to set the scene. And I'm pleased that you mentioned geographers, because I am a geographer. So I have every right to be interested in climate from what you've been saying. Thanks also to the Diplomat, and a particular thanks to Chris Skidmore and the Mission Zero Coalition, not just for convening this summit so soon after COP28, but for bringing together delegates representing over 100 countries, leading NGOs and international businesses. And the Mission Zero Coalition was launched earlier this year to build momentum from the UK's independent review of net zero. And that review concluded that net zero represents the growth opportunity of the 21st century. And it made the authoritative case for why the benefits of investing today outweigh the costs. Why net zero can materially improve people's lives. And why we must act decisively. And it sought to build on the strong start that the UK had to its net zero journey. As Professor Kapoor has just said, as Prime Minister, I announced that the UK will eradicate its contribution to climate change by 2050, becoming the first G7 country to place this commitment in law. An ambitious target, but a target supported by the scientific community and backed by the Committee on Climate Change. And the committee made clear that we had laid the foundations to achieve a net zero economy, that it was necessary and that it was feasible. At that time, 400,000 people were already employed in low-carbon supply chains. New green technology was already contributing 45 billion to our economy every year, and we'd begun to phase out highly polluting vehicles, and we committed to phasing out unabated coal power stations by 2024. We introduced the 25-year Environment Plan, tackling plastic waste, water pollution, the loss of biodiversity, and of course we successfully bid to host COP26 in Glasgow. Now, successive governments have continued that work over recent years. The Net Zero Strategy was published in 2021, setting out how the UK can secure 500,000 new jobs and unlock further investment in the green economy. Investment into offshore wind has made it one of the cheapest forms of renewable energy, and at times wind energy is meeting up to 50% of the UK's electricity needs. And I'm proud to say that Britain set a new record of generating electricity without coal during my time as Prime Minister. And no country in the G7 has done more than the UK to cut its emissions. We have provided global leadership. But I'm pleased to say that today, around 90% of the world has net zero targets, and every G7 country has now committed to net zero by 2050 or sooner. Binding targets help to focus the attention of policymakers, but they achieve little on their own without decisive action. Our sea levels are continuing to rise at an alarming rate. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is becoming more concentrated. Average global temperatures are increasing, and the current trend suggests that human-induced warming will exceed 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels by the early 2030s. We need to do much more as an international community if we are to meet the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. I welcome the outcome of COP28 in keeping this landmark goal within reach. Earlier this week, there was a real fear that we would not see an agreement at the end of COP28. So the good news is that an agreement was reached and it kept our goal within reach. But the bad news is that the world is not currently on track to meet this target, and without a step change in our efforts, it will be missed. Sea levels will be higher. Small island states will become uninhabitable or submerged underwater. Millions more people will suffer food insecurity and be at risk of flooding and droughts. Livelihoods will be destroyed. Ecosystems like our rainforests and coral reefs will be decimated. And the social, political and economic effect.
Areas of sort of delivery and implementation, they really sort of highlight as a result of the COP and its outcomes. Then we'll get into a more broader discussion about some of those themes I mentioned on the global stocktake text, on the loss and damage fund, on a number of those sort of initiatives that have been taken forwards, both on sort of trebling of renewables and doubling of energy efficiency, and also additional climate finance measures. But I'm going to turn first to Vijay, if that's okay, and then we're going to sort of run along the panel before then sort of opening up to a wider discussion. Vijay.
Great, thank you, Chris, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to look at all of this. The one thing you didn't say about Dubai and COP was it was very big. We all spent a lot of time moving around the place, and it was very, very tiring. So we're all slightly recovering from it. I think Lady May actually said most of the headlines. So let's just run through the big ones of mitigation. There was a lot on adaptation as well. It may be worth spending a little bit more time on that. Nature, forestry and so on, and then finance as well. And quite a few of the non-negotiated, the much broader outcomes of getting, whatever it was, 80,000 people together, and a lot of global business, and a lot of global civil society was there, as well as obviously almost all governments. So a tremendous amount was done in the margins of that as well. So the first one is on transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly and equitable manner, to achieve net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science. And all those phrases are quite important because they start to set the framework for the nationally determined contributions, these famous NDCs. We agreed at COP26 on the ratchet that will be a yearly process. That is really crucial. So countries need to take that away and ensure that their own contributions are then, and their own whole of economy changes are based on that pathway. And that, I think, is really crucial. There were the commitments mentioned, renewable energy, tripling renewable energy capacity globally, doubling the global average annual rate of energy efficiency improvements, which is going to be as hard to calculate as it is to say. But those are important things because energy efficiency is crucial. Just to say on the tripling renewable energy capacity, one of the most remarkable and heartening things of COP, I found, was that that is totally doable. In fact, it may even be beaten because the rate of energy, of renewable energy going in is so high. And so that is a really great commitment. We ought to be able to do it. We will then want to, I think, do even more on that. Loss and damage was a real roller coaster. TC4, which happened a few weeks before COP, was not easy, to put it mildly, and our negotiators had a very difficult time. It looked as if there was no deal. The UAE, who, by the way, played a blinder in a lot of this, and the UAE presidency have done really well. They were, how to put this nicely, they were tough, at times almost brutal. They really forced the pace, but you've got to do it as COP presidency, as we did in Glasgow. So a lot of kudos goes to them, and I think to Dr. Sultan, Majid, all of them really. But loss and damage, they really forced TC5, that final deal, and pushed it through, and then used that very much at the beginning in order to get, to give some momentum to the whole of COP. And that worked well, both as a tactic and as a kind of showing that there was commitment, there was serious money. To be honest, going in, we wondered whether that would be A, possible, and B, there'd be any money into the loss and damage fund. I think we ended up with about £650 million, which is nowhere near enough, but it is a very, very big down payment into loss and damage, and that's really crucial. So that was really good. There was a lot on forestry and nature, as I mentioned, including a commitment to halt and reverse forest loss by 2030. And I'll come back to why that's crucial. Tell me when to stop, Chris, by the way. On the non-negotiated outcomes, just a few I wanted to bring out. Climate resilient debt clauses are now becoming much more mainstream. And a lot of people were looking at a lot of countries, institutions, the multilateral development banks really stepped in a way which frankly was a little bit more reticent at COP26. I remember I was doing that then. Now they're really, in a big way, stepping into climate. And they're doing so in a fascinating way, which is on climate adaptation. So let me just spend a moment on that. I saw two things at this COP that were new. The MDBs mainstreaming climate and adaptation in particular through all of their programs to a tremendous extent. That's important. Countries also thinking about adaptation as something that we all need to do. Every country, every sector of society will need to adapt to climate change. And there's a kind of full stop at the end of that, which I don't think was completely appreciated before. And what that means is climate adaptation is not just about international financial flows. It's about the decisions that we all, local governments, central governments, businesses, people, will be taking as we spend our own money in whatever form that is over the next decades in order to make sure those investments work. That may mean siting a school here or here. If this one's 10 degrees hotter in 10 years' time, it's not going to be usable as a school. So there's a question there about the data and about can we actually make that granular enough for every country. There was quite a lot of progress on that. And that all fell under the framework of what is the global goal on adaptation. And that was new. I think it's significant progress because it does start to bring together all of these issues into one. Clearly, international finance, MDB finance, is going to be a part of it, but it's also very much about bringing everyone and all of the institutions in countries to think about climate adaptation. There was a lot on finance in general, dismayed that developed countries had not met the 100 billion goal before, by the deadline, which was 2020. We probably met it in around 2021, 22, so I think it was the Germans and Canadians doing some work on that and the OECD. So good, but there's a lot more to go. And the reason for mentioning that is it's all in the context of what is snappily called the new collective quantified goal, which is going to be for the Declaration of Energy Companies, which the UAE masterminded, which puts quite a lot of weight and the technical expertise and the cooperation of international energy companies to tackle some of the wells which are still flaring off huge amounts of carbon into the world, some of them uncapped, methane, and I think there is one, I probably wouldn't in this gallery say where, which emits more carbon than the whole of the UK economy at the moment. We can tackle those remarkably quickly, and there's some good commitments to do so. There was a good focus on forestry, I think a little less satisfaction with the way that forestry carbon markets are working, and that's going to be very important. But overall, my sense, just a bit of a punchline, it was whole of economy, all countries, direction. So I think in our terms, we're focusing quite hard on where that's going to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. It's great to get that perspective from the British government on COP. I'm now going to turn to one of the sectors you mentioned. Heather Buchanan represents Bankers for Net Zero, which has under, I think, its umbrella a number of key organisations and financial institutions across the UK. And Heather, I know you were working specifically on some financial regulations. You have your Project Perseus, where you're looking to try and establish greater sort of financial certainty around some of that regulatory process. What were the best sort of takes for COP for you? What did you see as sort of highlights, and where do you see the direction going, particularly around sort of financing for climate projects?
Oh, certainly. Thank you very much, Chris. So, I mean, I think first and foremost, it's really important to recognise just how far we've come, even just from COP26, and it's hard to believe that it was, you know, just a couple of years ago when we had the private sector kind of piling in and making commitments that, I mean, quite frankly, I think most people at that point really didn't understand the impact of. There was a lot of pushing and cajoling and knowing that we needed to get someplace, but the level and pace of change that's happened over the last couple of years has actually been quite extraordinary, and I think that, so from a private sector view, first and foremost, you talk about numbers and hundreds of billions, whatever. This is a challenge that absolutely needs, I think at least 50% is going to have to come from the private sector. And the money's there. I mean, everybody keeps on saying the money's there, this money's there. But fundamentally, we're starting from a financial system that's evolved over hundreds of years that has worked on different models and different numbers and different understandings. I mean, at no point have we had nature and loss and adaptation sitting on your balance sheet, your profits and loss, and we're now having to kind of understand that. And so the entire global economy is really fundamentally redefining itself. And that's going to be a kind of a critical starting point for when we're looking at how we finance things in the future. So one of the good things from our perspective is there's a kind of a policy task force that's come out, so we can start to look internationally around policy and regulation and trying to get some of the really kind of core fundamentals of how our economies work pivoted in a way that kind of recognises the value that these come from. So I think that task force, which we haven't mentioned before, is a really important first step. Of course, the big thing from there in terms of actually getting finance mobilised, and again, from a private sector point of view, there is no lack of ambition. I think, if anything, what I've seen happening just over the last year and a bit is probably a frustration from those that are ahead of the game, with that feeling that they need more support in terms of the policy and the regulatory environment on a local level. And even in the UK, where we're arguably quite ahead, we still have a legacy of policy and regulation that's not necessarily going to be fit for the new world that we're going into. And so there's going to need to be a lot of kind of rolling up the sleeves. I mean, Chris very kindly mentioned Project Perseus. It's about one data point. We're spending a whole year on trying to get one data point, electricity, in a certified, kind of an insurable way. And so even the really basics, we're having to almost redefine and measure. And that's the kind of nerdy, geeky stuff is actually going to get the international finance flows moving forward.
Thank you very much. We're going to turn now to Amelia and Gask. Amelia, thank you so much for standing in at the last notice, but delighted to have you here, not least because obviously the European Union sought to play a leading role in the negotiations. There was a number of initiatives that sort of came forward. The global goal on renewables energy efficiency, for example. I think we've got 130 countries now signed up to that. So it began as an EU initiative. So delighted to get your perspective on COP28, where you saw some of the key outcomes and where you think there is potentially more work that still needs to continue.
Yeah, so thank you, Chris, and very happy to step in. In fact, I had just about the time to receive a line from the colleagues who are still in Dubai and about to fly back. Can I start by first thanking you and Prime Minister May for, in fact, putting into law the net zero targets in the UK 4.5 years ago. In the EU, we like to say that we are the first continent to have aimed for net zero for 2050, but before the continent, just off our shores, there was a moment of true climate leadership. And again, thank you and congratulations for this. That did play a role in our own decision-making process. And since I'm here representing the EU in the UK, I would also like to use this opportunity to pay tribute to Pete Betts. Pete Betts was the negotiator for the EU and the UK in Paris, COP21 for the Paris Agreement, and a towering figure whom we lost, unfortunately, a few weeks before COP. And I'm sure there'll be an opportunity in the next panel as well to pay tribute to Mr. Hook, the Bangladeshi towering figure as well, who did so much, notably for loss and damage. Now, looking at what happened at COP, the outcome for us is historic. This is a proper word. The words transition away from fossil fuels. Perhaps many did not expect that to happen. We were aiming for even more, phase out fossil fuels. But we believe this is the start of the phase out, if you allow the pun. And indeed, and I would join Vijay on that remark, the UAE presidency, especially in the crunch time at the end, played a very significant role and showed leadership, and we're very thankful for them. Not everything is in there that we wanted to see, of course, and the remarks notably by the Alliance of Small Island States are entirely legitimate on what still needs to happen. Nevertheless, we do believe this is incremental and positive progress. In some ways, you could argue that the consensus we've reached is an end in itself for what it says on multilateralism, so it is not dead, and we've showed that collectively. But it's also not an end in itself. What it needs to be compared against is the science and the actual climate situation. So that's why in the coming years, it's absolutely key that everyone not only looks at the text, but also at the spirit of the UAE consensus and does the homework for the next wave, notably of nationally determined contributions. There's been a lot of positive and good remarks from Vijay on more of the sectoral achievements and some of the specific items, and I join on absolutely all of them. And I'd be happy if the opportunity comes in the discussion to spend more time on explain what's our take on this strategy around sectoral engagement as opposed to the more traditional aspect of COP.
Thank you very much. And we're going to turn to Professor Frans Berkhout, as mentioned earlier, the first assistant principal for climate, I think, maybe in the UK. Well,
I think maybe,
take that.
Possibly.
And I know the KCO had an active presence at COP, and we're delighted to get your reflections on the successes and opportunities that COP28 presents.
Yes, I may start with a slightly more sceptical note, because of course there's been a lot of, warm words. I think, how do you make sense of COP28 is, of course, against the context of what we already knew, which was that, projected global emissions are not on track to achieve 1.5 degrees, and we're a long way short of it. The Global Stocktake technical report released by the UNFCCC about a month before the meeting showed that the gap was about 20 to 24 gigatons of carbon dioxide in 2030, and that compares with global emissions of 40. So, a long way short. On the other hand, and I think this is also a really significant contextual fact, there is now a really profound and unstoppable global momentum away from fossil fuels and towards zero carbon electricity in particular. So that the World Energy Outlook by the IEA predicts that by 2030 we'll have seen peaking of emissions from coal, oil and gas. And indeed it is quite possible that next year will be the peak of greenhouse gas emissions globally as well. So you'll see a peak by 2025. So we're now at the top of an historic era, and after that there's really a decline. And the great reason here is to do with this huge momentum around renewables. And the primary reason for that is China. So in 2023 alone, China has installed between 210 and 230 gigawatts of electric power capacity. That compares with the installed capacity in the whole of the UK of 77. So China has installed 3 times the British grid this year alone in renewables. And the reason why the world will achieve actually its renewables target and this massive, bending of the curve is very much to do with what's going on in China, of course in the United States as well, with the IRA and in the EU and in other countries. But that is unstoppable, I think. On the other hand, we also know, of course, that 2023 is a very unique year in terms of the climate. The Copernicus system shows that we are now, since June 2023, in completely uncharted territory in terms of the global climate. So since that time, global surface air temperatures have been consistently 1.5 degrees centigrade above the 1850-1900 baseline, which is the one that's used for the target setting. And indeed, for 2 days in November, and there's a statistical model that underlies this, so there's some difficulty here, the anomaly was over 2 degrees. So the world is already probably past 1.5. And although Dr. Sultan talked about the North Star and so on, actually it's very unlikely that 1.5, even with overshoot scenarios, is something we'll achieve. So climate change is something that's become every day, and the expectation is that in the future this will only get worse. And there's still a huge amount to be done on emissions suppression that we need to do. And we see it in our students, a growing sense of despair, anxiety, and with all the profound social and political effects that Lady May talks about are important. I think I'll just make 4 quick points about COP28. One is on delegitimizing fossil fuels. I think that has really now begun to happen. The fact that the oil and gas sector was so much in evidence at COP28, the fact that they felt compelled to make an announcement on methane, I think is a signal of that. We are now in the end phase, and the consolidation in the sector and so on is also a signal about that. The final declaration is important, but we're really now in the era where fossil fuels gradually become delegitimized. I think the methane agreement is really significant. Methane accounts for about 21% of total greenhouse forcing at a global level, and the fact that 29 of the major companies said that they would bring that to zero by 2030 is a really significant thing. And the reason they're doing that is because we have satellite surveillance now, and so sadly lost is a breakthrough. But of course, the 700 million that has been of dollars that have been pledged to it is a very long way short of the 100 billion a year that is expected to be needed towards adaptation. So a long way short on that. And the final thing I thought was very interesting, I think in international climate politics, where you need to look first is always US-China relations, because they're the big beasts, of course. The Sunnylands Agreement in November was very significant because it was a rapprochement of the great climate powers, and we hope that succeeds. And it was the one that really set important targets on renewables, and eventually led to the energy efficiency and methane agreements as well. So I think continuing to watch what the Americans and the Chinese are doing is crucial, and anything we can do to encourage that relationship and the ambition they show will also be very important. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Frans. I think to sort of take up the points you've made around the climate science and whether COP28 addressed whether we're still keeping 1.5 degrees on track, as it were. Interesting to get sort of panel's views on the actual global stocktake text, obviously the core outcome of COP28. Because obviously it was a bit of a roller coaster. We had an initial draft, and then we had a revised draft, and then finally we had a compromise text. But the final text obviously omitted a number of statistical outcomes, both around the provision of renewable energy, potentially setting sort of percentage targets on methane. And I wondered whether the panel had any sort of reflections on the stocktake text itself in terms of actually, is it going to deliver over the next 2 years into Azerbaijan and Brazil, and what countries can take from the global stocktake text when developing their national determined contributions, which is obviously a key part of this, is now countries now need to come forward with revised, more detailed, cross-sectoral, national determined contributions. I don't know whether anyone had any sort of reflections on the actual stocktake text and what sort of is missing from it. Maybe Frans, if you could ask yourself and work backwards.
The stocktake text is quite legalistic. I don't know whether you've all read it. The way it's written, it reads like a treaty, which I found, to be frank, a slightly odd outcome of a political meeting. It'd be interesting to know why it has that form. The crucial thing that people looked at was, of course, this transition from, and it wasn't phase out and so on. I think semantics obviously counts in those kinds of political agreements. But as I think I implied, I think in the background, this transition is happening for many reasons. They're partly because of policy, but mainly actually because technology is changing, prices are falling, flows of investments are happening. Energy economies are transforming at an incredibly rapid rate, and sometimes actually the policymakers are a little bit behind that, creating the institutional systems that will allow these innovations really to be adopted and widespread. So I think my own sense about the document is that it is quite a cautious set of statements. It's obviously a negotiated text. It looks like a treaty, which is slightly odd because it's not. I think it's called the Dubai Agreement, I think he called it.
The UAE.
UAE Agreement, yeah, that's right. And I suspect actually the thing to look at now is what happens in COP30 in Brazil, because that's when the new NDCs come. And, they need to be kind of ahead of a curve. I think, the IEA scenarios are always so revealing because they often demonstrate that actually, without you noticing, things happen much more quickly. And it would be so great if COP could actually, for once, be ahead of what is actually happening in the world. So there's also the sense that although COP is always looked at as a place where these significant announcements are made, it's actually a little bit behind the curve. It would be great if the politicians, the negotiators, could step one more step and actually be ahead of the curve next time. Yeah.
Amelia, obviously the EU came to the negotiations with some clear targets, I think at 11 terawatts of renewable energy by 2030, I think a sort of doubling of energy efficiency measures from 2% to 4%. I think there was a clear statistical sort of point to deliver, and obviously that wasn't reflected in the final text. Do you sort of feel that that was a missed opportunity, or do you feel that's sort of the reality of the situation means that sort of we've had to keep it fairly broad?
No, again, the text itself, in our view, has historic contents, is incremental, is consensual by nature, and of course we hear the remarks that some would describe as legalistic, some would point to the constructive ambiguity, that's a lot in the text. It's all, that's how the process works, and again, I would absolutely agree with you that two things now matter: what we make of the text as countries, the homework in the next 2 years, and everything that happens outside that text. You're absolutely right that even if the IEA themselves have to revise their own targets every year, it says there are some success stories out there, and there are things definitely happening outside this text. Now, when it comes to the goal to triple renewable energy and doubling energy efficiency, and I would also extend that to the other sectoral campaign. This question of sectoral campaigns outside of the negotiated text is a relatively recent trend. You could argue they've existed for a while in some setups. The UN has pushed a lot of them. The UK presidency of COP26 made that quite a central pivot of the strategy, right? And we've always heard from some voices that the EU is not doing enough on that. We're focusing too much on the negotiating text and we don't necessarily believe enough in side campaigns. That's something I absolutely reject. What is true is that we are sometimes selective in which campaigns, which sectoral push we support, either because there's not necessarily a full consensus between our member states, so that's why sometimes you see some member states supporting some campaigns and not others, but also to avoid sometimes a double action, right? If something is already happening at the UN level, do we need a separate declaration on this or that? But nevertheless, if you look at the Global Methane Pledge, EU-US initiative, which the UK joined very early on and was an active member of, deforestation at COP26, we signed, but not only that, we've now, within a year and a few months, we've enacted domestic regulation on importing deforestation. Methane, just before COP28, we've also done our homework. So we sign these documents and then we follow up domestically, and I think that's what we hope to see from others. But even beyond, again, what member states do, there's a lot to do and a lot that businesses can do that's not necessarily directly tied to what you find in the negotiated text of COPs.
And when it comes to those NDCs, obviously the Commission and the EU have to play a delicate balance. Its national governments will determine their NDCs into Brazil and COP30. There was also a call, however, for greater consistency in the quality and reporting of the NDCs. Is that something the EU thinks they could play a role in helping their member countries in developing their NDCs post COP28?
Yeah, so it's interesting. That's something we're really good at, templates and coming up with forms and templates. We have this domestic experience that member states have to fill templates on national energy and climate plans, on air quality, etc. So it's a real administrative quality we have there. In terms of NDC, so we updated ours just before COP28, and what we tried to do, we had one just before COP26 to help send a signal and support the British presidency to say, see, COP26 is starting, the EU, we're trying to lead by example, we've already adopted our 55% NDC. What's interesting here is that we were not able before COP to upgrade our headline target from 55%. But on the other side, and we think that's what matters most, we have a high degree of confidence in the fact that we can reach, in fact, more than 55% reduction by 2030. We're hoping to reach 57%, and we believe we have a fully plan, we have a full policy plan at the EU level. Some of it still needs to happen at member state, and obviously implementation. And that's the model we humbly hope to show to others. We are absolutely happy with others copy-pasting the sort of regulations and plans we've established, and also the way we distribute the effort between countries. If you allow me a very niche point, but something that I think says something about the continuity of UK-EU ambition. The UK hopes to reduce its emissions by 68% by 2030. In the EU, it's minus 55%. They are, I don't know if this is understood from all, they are in fact the same target, right? So what happens in the EU is we distribute this target to member states. So depending on where they were in 1990, depending on how rich as well they are, some member states have to do more than others. And as the Climate Change Committee said, had the UK been in the EU, its target under the EU system would have been 68%. Now, the UK government did not have to set that target, so it's a sign of their ambition and a desire to continue progressing on that ambitious path. Next steps on our side, within a month, we will have an impact assessment for our 2040 target. So Commissioner Hoekstra and Vice President Šefčovič have announced our political target to reduce emissions by 90% by 2040. And now we're coming with the impact assessment, and then later on, yes, it will be transcribed. What comes out of this process will be transcribed as an international commitment.
Heather, as my net zero review sort of set out, the finance sector investors need certainty and clarity on policy frameworks to make the necessary investments. Investments around fossil fuel industries was part of the text talking about ending inefficient fossil fuel investment. Do you feel that the global stocktake text does provide that necessary certainty and clarity for investors?
Well, absolutely, because it is, to a certain extent, it's the policy signals, isn't it? And as we say, that there is that shift, and it will, like anything where you're kind of steering a large ship as it around, it's giving a clear direction of travel. And so from our perspective, absolutely, that, the focus on the increase in renewables, the focus on the kind of transition away, phasing out, transition away, they're kind of semantics at this point. Obviously, phasing out would have been the ideal, but that certainly from a kind of direction of travel point is actually enough for a lot of the markets, and particularly for when you've got your larger financial institutions who are working with hard-to-abate sectors. And we're very clear, that this has got to be about a sensible transition and working with, that kind of level of stewardship that the financial services sector has with its clients. It's those kind of things where that makes those conversations much clearer, saying, well, this, there is not a future for you, in kind of 5, 10, 15 years if you carry on like you do. And so things like that are incredibly important from a financial services sector point of view. Listen, we're flying, we're building the plane as we fly it, I guess is what you say. And so you get that direction of travel, and then there's a lot of backfilling which has to happen around what the policy and the regulation looks like. So, and that's why we really welcome the policy task force coming out, still at an international level. And I think that the key thing, and certainly this is what we do, in the UK with Bankers for Net Zero, we've been having conversations internationally with other partners, is then how that gets implemented and actually how those change is dependent on the cultural, regulatory, legislative environment of every single jurisdiction. So that's when the tricky stuff comes out, because you've got the tensions in the system. But that direction of travel, if anything, it sets the private sector off in a direction. And I mean, absolutely to your point, I would like to see in a couple of years' time that policymakers are becoming a bit bolder within this and ahead of the curve, that we see a lot more kind of collaboration, I think, between private and public sector, because that's the only way we're going to get there as well.
Vijay, in terms of the final decision, the text, I mean, you're mean that we don't get the same sort of level of pace and scale we might have done otherwise?
I think you never go into a negotiation not aiming quite high. There's a whole series of areas that are being kicked off to the next COP, given that what's the dreadful Article 6.1 treatment. So there is stuff that we would have liked to have got, we didn't get. It was a compromise. We would have liked to have been higher in several areas. But it was far more important to reach a deal, and a deal that everyone can actually live with. I think it does do some quite significant things, so that is really important. I think it keeps 1.5 alive. And I want to come back to just something that Frans said, which is 1.5 is a global warming target. That does not mean, and I worry people misinterpret this sometimes, it doesn't mean that locally, in some areas of the world, it's going to be vastly different from 1.5 and much worse. And we're already seeing that. I think we see very clearly in our global satellite coverage of what's going on in both the Arctic and particularly the Antarctic at the moment. You see it in some, there are very big global temperature changes. So some communities, some people, some areas are going to have to cope with something vastly different from 1.5 even now, and that is a big challenge. So that is, but it, averaged out, yes. Just in terms of the way the text works, I mean, look, it's just a text. It doesn't do anything. So we have to take that and do a lot of things to make it actually have any function. What have we done in the past which has worked? You take the text, you use it to set a political direction, which leads sometimes into law and sometimes into various bits of regulation. Why does that matter? Because that doesn't do anything either. It drives investment and it drives future market shaping. And Chris, you said all that in your report, but it works around the world in every country. Governments then put in some money and can take some of the risk. Companies put in vastly more money, and that drives technology change. And those are really important. We're seeing now some of the outcomes of previous COPs in terms of the technologies that have been developed. And why is that important? Because that simply drives the economics and the cost. And you bring the cost of, say, solar panels down enough. That's exactly why I think the Chinese amazing scale, which I saw near Suzhou about 2 months ago in Beijing, it is gigantic and it's driven by cost. That cost is not a localized phenomenon in China. It's why all of you can now buy solar panels cheaply here. So a combination of the EU Green Deal, IRA, investments that we all do. And why would people invest? Because they see a market coming in which they can make money. And that's a sort of transmission mechanism. But we have to follow that every step of the way, working really closely with the private sector and investors, because it drives investor behavior. Just 3 other things. The focus on hard-to-abate sectors is getting stronger. And that is really good. Because they're hard to abate. So steel, cement, concrete, agriculture, housing, easy to abate. In fact, transport, we're all getting to ZEVs in some countries. That is going very well indeed, actually. The building of investable opportunities for the private sector is a long-term sort of challenge. It was very difficult 15, 20 years ago in terms of mitigation and renewable energy. It doesn't take much public money now. That's where I think the focus now is on adaptation. So we ran several events in COP, which are all about how do you get the private sector to invest in adaptation? It's not just a public sector thing, because you need a very large amount of money to adapt. And the good answer is there are plenty of good investable opportunities, and we've proven some of them from cold chains in Kenya through to clean cooking stoves. There are so many things which in terms of really basic adaptation can help development, poverty, gender equality, and climate adaptation and mitigation all at the same time. So that's where we want to put our money, I think, in future. Where I'd like to go further is on forests and nature and the financing behind that. I think if you look at the kind of maturity of our discussion and of the systems, they're quite mature on mitigation in general. They're getting there on adaptation. We're behind, and we could go a lot further in terms of forestry. How do you value biodiversity? This is the kind of Kunming-Montreal process. And how do you really cost in the externalities of a combination of biodiversity and standing forests? So that is something the UK has kicked off at COP26, and I think will be a very big theme. And so it's very nice to see our Brazilian friends make that a high priority for COP30.
Well, we've got a number of other issues still to cover as part of the agreement that came forward on the loss and damage fund, and the global goals and adaptation. But I'm going to open up sort of questions from the floor. I think we've got a question from the High Commissioner for Grenada, Her Excellency Richard Crowley, who's going to ask a question about loss and damage, I believe. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the panel for expounding so much on some of the outcomes from the summit. So a big win, as was mentioned throughout the discussions, is the loss and damage and the creation of that fund, as well as the 700 million commitment, which still falls short significantly. Despite being a big win, there are continuing questions and contentions around the management of the fund, as well as how the monies will be allocated. What progress do you see being made in terms of managing those funds and raising the amount of money that needs to be raised? I mean, estimated right now, it's hundreds of billions annually just to account for damages. So what progress do you see being made, and what more can be done to address this?
Thank you, Your Excellency. And loss and damage fund, I think stands now at 770 million, but you'll see right, I think it's 2% potentially of the total that is needed in the longer term. But nevertheless, this announcement on the loss and damage fund came early in COP, quite a surprise to everyone that the gavel sort of came down. I don't know whether any members of the panel have reflections on the fund itself and the nature of how it might evolve for the future. Maybe Frans, I can start with you.
Yeah, so I think the loss and damage fund is really fundamental and probably the other great agreement apart from the transition away from fossil fuels. You know, the focus of this fund needs to be on the most vulnerable nations and the most vulnerable sectors and groups within those countries. Adaptation by its nature is quite context-specific and localized. You know, in one place it will be to do with how you make agriculture drought-resistant. In another place it will be to do, in a small island developing state, it will be to do with how you manage flood resilience, for instance, or storm resilience. The projects that develop out of that will necessarily often have to be quite local, very specific to the context, to do with the capacities and capabilities and values of the people living there. So it is, but in that way, it is slightly different from mitigation investment, which is, you know, we know what the broad technologies are, we know what the infrastructure might be. It is much more specific. So I think clearly, you know, if $100 billion a year is what the models tell us is probably the damage, then there's the question of, you know, what countries contributing those funds in the end are willing to do. The Americans are still not bought into this. They've resisted this for 30 years. Of the 770, I think 17.5 million came from the United States, so they still need some convincing here. Very important that they do play a role eventually. It'll need to be a bigger number. But then actually the development of projects and then the disbursement by the World Bank into those, which obviously has a very well-established procedure for making these kinds of investments, will need to be developed. I think the other thing that's really important here is the evaluation. The evaluation in terms of the increasing resilience that you create in the communities that you're bringing up. You know, whether you're building a seawall, you're making available drought-resistant seeds. You're developing more storm-resistant buildings, for instance. You're looking at critical infrastructure so that they can be survive certain kinds of extreme events, managing landslips in cities, and so on. So really understanding what the added value is of a project, and then seeking to mainstream it, I think, as well. And I think that is one of the points that Vijay made earlier, is that the MDBs in their allocation of funding, but also obviously, you know, aid coming from other countries, that has to be now always mainstreaming, not just mitigation, but climate adaptation. That just needs to be part of every project. Every project should have a sort of climate test in it, and I think that's the way to go. So it's a really complex area to get right. There's a lot of dynamism. There's a lot of research. I'm one of the people who've done a lot of the research, so we know a lot about this stuff. It can all be done, but it needs to be mainstreamed, and we need to find a way of evaluating what the impact will be on well-being and economic performance and so on as well. Yeah.
Heather, can I bring you in actually from the private sector? Yeah. 770 million. It's not going to go very far. What do you think can be done to really sort of promote now this investment vehicle?
So, I mean, to the mainstreaming point, I mean, this is where actually the likes of the World Bank and MDBs and governments actually do have a pivotal role, particularly in the nascent stages of this. It's a bit of a shame that, I mean, it's loss and damage sounds very negative, but it's, you know, we're talking about there's actually opportunity within that in terms of better outcomes for people, and so there's probably an element of looking at where those opportunities lie, but having that 770 million to start with, if used well and effectively, and using the kind of slicing, you know, the top bit of risk, and giving clear policy signals and baking that part of that element into the process will actually unlock tenfold in terms of the private sector. And that is got to be the key. Otherwise, we're just looking at a cycle of everybody kind of putting money into things and it's being seen as a sink, you know what I mean, as a money sink. And it's not that at all. It's just got to be part of the valuation of our economy and our world going forward. And this is where it is difficult now because we don't have all the metrics for it. We don't have the data. We don't necessarily have the impact studies that we need to get mainstream finance comfortable, and that's the role that governments really need to play. And so rather than thinking in this kind of binary, like, oh, there's either, you know, it's got to be public money goes in, it goes into a sink. It's like, no, you use the public money to de-risk things till we get to the point where things do become mainstreamed, and then they can sit on their own 2 feet, and it just becomes part of the system. And that's really what we need to focus on, is making sure that the system works rather than trying to kind of backfill into essentially a system and policies that aren't fit for the 21st century anymore.
Amelia, do you have any reflections on the loss and damage fund?
Yeah, so you're aware of the history of the EU's position on this topic. We've always felt and known that there was something beyond adaptation, that the discussion could not stop at mitigation and adaptation. And you will remember from COP27 that the EU and I believe New Zealand were the first to move from northern countries, if you like, to make it happen and agree on this. So, look, the operationalization of the fund is a good step. Yes, there are still many elements to discuss, and this is an incremental process. We did make a first significant contribution at the launch of the fund. We also signaled our contribution early on to encourage others. We pay tribute to Germany in particular for their first contribution, and already in 2 weeks we've reached, you're right, more than $750 million. What matters to us going forward is a couple of things. First, the donor base, right? We believe more countries can and should contribute, and that's, the current wording is interesting as far as possible. What's also important for us is the priority. So loss and damage is a global issue, but it disproportionately affects developing countries, and in particular the most vulnerable countries. And they are the ones we hope can have the fastest access to the funds. But beyond that, the larger reflection, there are many other threads of thoughts and discussions on finance, but what also matters to us is the interplay with the other funds. So, for instance, it should not be the case that we forget about adaptation, for instance, funding. In our own internal funding programs, adaptation is a big item, and it has to be even bigger. There is still some funding that must happen for mitigation solutions. And so looking forward, it's about not losing track of this, but also the larger reflection on the role of the MDBs, reworking the structure. And there's a lot of these threads on which we are taking a constructive approach and hope to reach more results in the coming COPs.
Thank you. Vijay, loss and damage fund, obviously something where the UK has contributed, maybe not as much as some other countries, but you see this as a vital mechanism going forwards and how to develop it.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with everything everyone on the panel has said on this. It's important. We need to broaden the contributor base. Very much agree. We need to leverage as much as we can. If it's just a series of grant finance, this isn't going to do what it actually needs to do. It needs to be very much linked into adaptation. You want to adapt to climate change. There may be some losses then that one cannot adapt to, or a community can't. And that's where the fund will need to come in. But it's, I think there's quite a lot of still definition to do in the managing board we've got to set up, and as a World Bank SIF, that's going to bring its own particular structure. I mean, just three thoughts sort of just around that. One is, on the contributor base, it was great that the UAE contributed. Right? That is already something which means we're into a bigger contributor base. We would like a lot of other countries to contribute in whatever capacity they like. But second, not just countries, innovative finance is still there as one of the areas. We're looking for ways in which this can indeed be the fund can be made bigger through other finance mechanisms, still to be defined. So that's a big piece of work to come. Second, there is still, even with the loss and damage fund, a real problem of access to finance in every single way. So we've been co-chairing the coalition on access to finance, a lot of work with small island developing states, as you know, Commissioner. How do we actually take what's hundreds of billions sitting in some fund up here and get it to the right people quickly enough? It really just doesn't happen at the moment. It can, but it's certainly not always. So I think there is a lot more to do in terms of making sure that money flows to the right people who are indeed affected, and that will be partly the kind of accounting treatment and partly the monitoring, the evaluation that you've mentioned. And then finally, even though I think it's probably not enough, so what we will need is, as I think, sadly, but predictably, we're entering a world where there will be more climate shocks and more climate disasters. Countries, particularly developing countries with reduced fiscal space, will need to be able to react quickly. And so we've been championing this concept of the climate resilient debt clauses. Disaster happens, country doesn't have to pay its debt for a while, it'll then pick up where it left off, but basically all the debt repayments, whatever they've got, pause, and they will use that domestically. It's instant, it doesn't take approval by a committee sitting somewhere, you can go ahead. So there's a whole lot of buffers, financial and political, that we need to build into the system in what's going to be an increasingly climate-impacted world coming up.
Well, thank you, Vijay, and thanks to all the panellists for this opening discussion on the outcome of COP28. We've tried to squeeze a lot into our hour session. We're not successful always at covering every base in the 16 days worth of negotiations, but I think that gave a broad overview of what has been achieved and the importance now of going forwards with the national determined contributions into COP29. I'm delighted to have the ambassador of Azerbaijan here today, who's going to give some remarks later on, and proceed to Brazil and COP30. We're now going to have a short break. I can see that coffees and teas have been sort of wheeled in, so please do refresh yourselves, and we're going to reconvene in 10 or so minutes with a second panel on what should be the ambition moving forward at future COP summits. Thank you very much. as mentioned earlier, the topic of this second discussion is what should be the ambition moving forward at future COP summits. I'm delighted that this panel will be chaired by the Mayor of West Yorkshire, Tracy Brabin, a former colleague of mine in the House who's gone on to greater things and is a committed supporter of net zero. And I'm delighted to actually announce that I'll be sort of partnering with Mayor Brabin on a new power generation network report that's going to bring the renewable industry, the nuclear industry, the grid and infrastructure industries of the UK together to look at how we can focus on delivering what was actually the #1 mission in my net zero review, which is around how do we achieve the grid and infrastructure that's needed to be able to build out the capacity for clean and renewable power. So I'm delighted that Tracy's able to join us today to moderate this session. I'd also like to invite the panellists to the stage. They include the Right Honourable Lord Goldsmith of Richmond Park, another colleague of mine in government who's long been committed to the energy transition and to the environment. Her Excellency, the High Commissioner of Bangladesh, His Excellency, the Ambassador to Azerbaijan, as mentioned, are now going to be the hosts of COP29. And also finally, Dr. Helen Adams, a Senior Lecturer in Disaster Risk Reduction and Climate Change Adaptation at King's College London. So Tracy, if I can hand over to you and the panel, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If our colleagues could take a seat, I'll pop in the middle, if I may. Good stuff. Thank you, and thank you so much, distinguished guests and your excellencies. What an absolute pleasure to be here today, and also to be joining Chris Skidmore as co-chair of Mission Zero Coalition. It's a great opportunity for us to work together and for mayors to help deliver against the climate emergency. So, what we're going to be discussing today is following on from the previous panel, what happened at COP28. We're now going to move on to what should the future ambition for COP be. And I am delighted and humbled by the quality of guests here this afternoon. Before we move on just to hear from our guests, I just wanted to speak for a couple of minutes about what it means to be a mayor. I am the Mayor of West Yorkshire, which is a region of 2.8 million people. Big cities in my region, Leeds and Bradford. It has 7 universities, 9 further education colleges, and is a vibrant community. It has more manufacturing jobs than anywhere else in the north. So we were the home of the Industrial Revolution, and I hope that we are also the solution to the climate emergency. And I remember hearing the Mayor of New York saying that actually mayors are the tugboats that are pushing the tankers of government into the right position because we have power and money. And in the UK, there are 10 metro mayors. Sadly, there's only 1 woman metro mayor, so we definitely need to address that challenge. But as the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said at COP28, mayors should demand a seat at the table. We are playing a key role in combating the climate emergency. And we know, don't we, that cities are responsible for 70% of global emissions. But Climate Change Commission estimates 1/3 of emissions are in control of local leaders. We have the mandate to have that just and fair transition to a net zero future, because 1 in 5 jobs will disappear in my region because it's manufacturing, and there's going to be 6.3 million people across the UK that need that retraining. So we're going to be throwing our full political support behind the renewables revolution. And the reason why I think mayors are part of the solution is because when the public are asked who do they trust in politics, Sadly, MPs and peers, sorry, Zach, are at the bottom, and mayors and local leaders are at the top and very, very trusted. And we can use creativity and data and also the power and money that comes with devolution. In West Yorkshire, I've only been the mayor for 2.5 years, but we have brought in £2.8 billion worth of investment into our region through devolution. And we have responsibilities over housing, transport, economy, skills, and climate. And in every single one of those responsibilities, I have taken action to tackle the climate emergency, to hit our zero carbon emissions target of 2038. And let's not forget, government is 2050. So we are acting at speed in transport, whether that's developing mass transit, whether that's bringing in the mayor's fare, a cheaper fare, so people use buses, whether that's working on a better homes hub, mass retrofit, loans for homeowners who want to retrofit their homes, skills, 1,000 green jobs for young people was one of my manifesto pledges. We've exceeded that target. There are many items that I can deliver at speed. And of course, my climate and environment plan, £40 million has been allocated for that plan. To do it properly, I need 4.4 billion, but we have to start somewhere. So on that note, I'm going to take a pew and I'm going to ask our very honoured guests to speak for about 5 minutes about their vision for the future. And then I will definitely open it up to the audience. So I really hope we can have a good, robust discussion full of ideas and possibilities for the next phase beyond this COP. So thank you all so much. I'll take a pew and then we'll get started. Thank you. Okie dokie. So as we're talking about the future, I wonder whether His Excellency Elin Suleymanov would like to open it up about what you've taken from COP and then what you're looking at moving forwards for the hosting of COP next year in Azerbaijan, which I hope we will all be at. And what's the benefits for your country taking this leadership role?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. It's a pleasure to be at this distinguished panel. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and I want to thank especially the King's College, our colleagues from Net Zero Coalition, Policy Institute, and of course our good friends from the Diplomat for making this possible. Thank you very much. Madam Mayor, we have something in common with your city because Azerbaijan was the home of the first energy boom, first oil boom in the beginning of the 20th century, as Baku produced 50% of the global oil supply in 1910. So we're very hopeful that today, when we're transitioning to the green energy and the green transition is taking place in the region, Azerbaijan is already taking the lead, but we hope that COP29 will highlight and emphasize it and accelerate the transition. We take a very regional view. First of all, I want to thank our good friends at UAE because they've done a fantastic work, both logistically, but also bringing people together, trying to. And I know I heard some people said, "Look, I mean, it's not good enough." The protocol, it will never be good enough. For, by the end of the day, when you bring a very wide coalition of people and want to make it implementable, you understand that to make sure that it applies to everybody, it has to have some compromise decisions. But our ability of our colleagues at UAE to make it happen is very uniquely important, I think, and we should appreciate that. And we take lessons from them. I think that's important, as well as taking lessons from COP26 here when we were also present in Glasgow. One thing which made this particular decision in UAE to choose Azerbaijan as a president for COP29 is a very specific issue, which I don't know how much it was widely covered. For the Eastern and Central European group to nominate Azerbaijan as a presidency and as a host for the future COP29, it had to have no objection. It had to be a consensus decision, which meant that Armenia, our neighbor, with which we've been engaged with for 30 years conflict, had to agree. And as a matter of fact, for the first time since the independence of both Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Office of the President of the Republic of Azerbaijan and the Office of the Prime Minister of the Republic of Armenia together issued a joint statement in which Armenia graciously supported Azerbaijan's bid to host COP29. We supported their candidacy for the Bureau of Eastern European Group, and we reiterated our joint commitment to finding a peace agreement as soon as possible and normalize the relationship. Now, this is a very important issue because our officers, two of them, the highest officers in the country, never made a joint statement ever before. They made a joint statement supported by EU, maybe by Russia, by the United States, but they never just on their own, as a result of direct bilateral conversation, have done that. That's a very important contribution. So what you see is effort to produce a cleaner world already produces more peaceful world. I think that's very important. And there's a very important element to this as well, additional, that is after COP26, there were serious commitments and serious hopes to reduce coal pollution, to move forward with a reduction of the fossil fuel consumption. But we've seen so many conflicts flaring up. We saw the conflict between, we saw the situation between Russia and Ukraine, others, where both because of political issues, people had to go back on their commitments, but also simply the simple pollution from the fighting in the area produced enormous carbon footprint. So not only the environmental issues, but political issues bringing peace and a reduction of conflict by itself is already a good thing for the environment. And I think this should not be underestimated. So I think we're in a good position. We're very hopeful. Azerbaijan is, as an oil and gas producing country, is moving very much forward with green energy. We have actually began exporting we generate power from wind and solar. We made major commitments to increase our production of green energy. In fact, the area which was liberated in 2020 at the end of the conflict with Armenia will be all net zero. It's not an easy thing to do, but we're trying to work on this. They're already offsetting, net zero offsetting schemes for our oil production and gas production areas where the power supply to the rigs is either wind or solar generated. And together with our wonderful friends from Georgia, and I know Georgian ambassador was here, she promised to watch our panel online, so I hope she does. We work very closely on building undersea electricity cable in the Black Sea, in which we will now deliver to the Eastern Europe, to countries such as Bulgaria and Hungary and Serbia, not just oil, not just gas as it used to be, but also electricity produced from clean renewable sources, such as wind and solar. So I think it's a very good trajectory, but it needs to be supported. Now, one thing I wanted to say, and I don't want to take much of your time, we spoke about damage and loss, remedial measures, but I think even more important is a technology transfer and ability and availability of for developing nations to be able to access new technologies. I mean, for what we can talk a lot about this, but if you need to buy an electric car which is so expensive and it's so much cheaper to buy a diesel car which is very polluting, I mean, at the end of the day, people need to make decisions compared to their, according to their own demands and their own domestic priorities within every family. So I think technology transfer, availability of not just finances, but actually new industries, new production facilities within those countries is very important. As a mayor, you know, if you have somewhere in the developing world a battery producing factory, an electric car producing factory, it would be much easier for people to use these vehicles to be a little bit more involved with the new production, with new energy sources than it would be if we sit here, let's say in London or somewhere in Europe, and look at the developing world and tell them, look, this is how it should be done. Yeah, everybody, at the end of the day, everybody knows how it should be done. It's not an issue that nobody wants to drive an electric car. It's quieter, it's nicer, it doesn't go that far, but still. But the question is it available? Is it affordable? Can you do it? And as a country which up until, I think, end of this year, chairs the non-alignment movement, which is the second largest international organization after UN, Azerbaijan is the chair country of non-alignment movement since 2019, we have seen this kind of issues facing us. For instance, and I'll just step back and just use an example of vaccine distribution. Everybody talked about the need for vaccine. Everybody, our Western partners came up and said, everybody needs to be vaccinated. And then they grabbed all the vaccines and didn't let anybody have any. And that was a major issue for us at the NAM chairmanship, because it's everybody knows you need to get vaccinated, but if there's no vaccine, what do you do? So affordability over advanced technologies, affordability, access to not just financing, but also ability to produce and utilize that in daily lives of people. I think that's a key important. I think we will be working on this as well. Anyway, I don't want to take much of your time.
No, that was really interesting.
You.
And I think what a good news story about the collaboration and the fact that your mission to tackle a climate emergency has brought two traditional enemies together around the table to deliver. And I think your point about innovation and knowledge is really powerful as well, that you can't expect countries to do this on their own without the smarts and without the companies who are prepared to invest. So I think you make a really powerful point. And if I may come to Her Excellency, Saida Muna Tasneem, obviously collaboration is important, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how that's looking from your perspective.
Thank you very much. Well, let me congratulate you on your net zero by 2038.
Indeed.
Very commendable initiative, and mayors do matter. And I understand this time at the COP28, there was a meeting for the mayors. So I think mayors should be encouraged. And, speaking of my country, Dhaka city, it's now the second most densely populated cities in the world. And, we were discussing about ULAs and London City just before coming here, whether, it increases, because, the lanes are so small, whether it increases numbers of cars and long waits. So we need to have a balance, and Dhaka City has, I think, the largest, traffic jams. So coming back to, Bangladesh's perspective, Bangladesh was the LDC negotiator at the COP28, and therefore we speak the voice of climate vulnerables, and we were, during the COP26, the president of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is a forum of 56 countries, of most climatically vulnerable countries, and I know the High Commissioner of Barbados and Grenada is here, and I speak for all the climate, and Costa Rica, they're also a member of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. And therefore, at COP28, and what we expect in the future is that what was created in COP28 comes the Loss and Damage Fund, and, I think somebody spoke on it, but, the Loss and Damage Fund, again, if you need to focus more on how do you reduce vulnerability. You can't reduce vulnerability, but just by mitigation, because, that you still have the risk of natural disasters. So those countries that are continuously having natural disasters have already had losses. When the developed countries were emitting, these countries like Bangladesh, our carbon footprint is 0.45 metric ton, 0.45. It's as small as that. And yet, at COP21, we had pledged 3 times higher NDCs than Paris compared to 2015. In 6 years, we doubled in 2021. And, we will be probably going 3 times higher commitments for NDCs in the Brazil 2025. But what matters is, for climate vulnerable countries, is that we haven't received, we are disappointed still with COP28 because, the Loss and Damage Fund that has been created did receive a lot of, opposition. I don't want to name countries, but then at the end of the day, we saw that 770 million was collected, and, we congratulate UE for giving 100 million, Germany for contributing 100 million, and some other countries had contributed. UK had just repledged what they had pledged in 2021. So, we expect new additional funding by UK. Now, what happens to this fund? Again, the headquarters has gone to World Bank, and World Bank will be heading it. And that, again, what we want to see in the future is that the global multilateral financing architecture, that needs to be restructured, if you ask me, because without that, we have seen the Green Climate Fund, for example, and I'm talking about financing here, and that's most important for CVF and what we want to see in the future, and also for LDCs. So speak of LDCs, SIDS, and another thing, Bangladesh is not a SIDS, but we are a sinking coastline country, and there is a category called sinking coastline country. Our coastline have 19 districts that the IPCC report says would be going underwater by 2070. And that means nearly 30 million people, because we are 180 million people. It's a very densely populated country. And all the coastal cities are under this risk of, about 25 to 30 million people become climatically displaced. So for the loss and damage is very important. Now, what loss and damage has been caused over the past 50 years, no one can recover that for, small island countries or Bangladesh. But we can do, if we're looking into the future, then we need to have, the 26-member board of the Loss and Damage Fund at the World Bank. At least 50% or more should be from climate vulnerable countries. That's what we demand in the future. And that should be decided like that. We should have a big voice there, which we don't. And the other one is, the Santiago Network for the network, and I do pay my tributes to Dr. Salim ul Haq because, speaking today, he was the voice for loss and damage, and he really, really fought hard, but we lost him. But, his cause will not be lost. So the Santiago Network, we also didn't have a secretariat. So I've heard that the UNDRR has volunteered, and UNOPS, to have the secretariat, to be the secretariat for the Santiago Network. So this is how loss and damage was neglected. And even within the G77 in China, when it came to adaptation and loss and damage, there was a division. The LDCs and SIDS were on one side, and the developing countries, and I don't want to name, but G20 is responsible for 85% of global emissions. So, our voice was very strong as to we want to see, for us, it's an existential threat. So we need to exist first. And for that, 1.5 degrees is sacrosanct for us, so we must not lose sight of the 1.5 degrees goal at any cost. And we already know from scientific reports that we have lost the cause. That means we have crossed 1.5 degrees. And on the front of mitigation, I want to say that, we have seen that at the COP28 that 43% of additional emissions cut have to be done by 2030 if we want to meet the decade goal. And currently, the developed countries are falling short of 7 times lesser because they need to meet 7 times higher indices, higher ambitious indices in the Brazil or in the Azerbaijan. So we want to see this much higher and ambitious indices without which you cannot actually keep to 1.5 degrees. We cannot allow 1.5 degrees. Even a temporary diversion is going to cause sea level rise, and it's going to, make countries like Bangladesh go underwater. So in terms of that, mitigation, that's what we want to see. And, there's this new mechanism for financing, which is the quantitative, the post-2025 finance and a new collective quantified goals on climate finance. That needs to be, if you look at the situation and the status of financing right now, 100 billion, we've never seen that. Bangladesh has a national adaptation plan. Our Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, she's put that plan in 2009, right after coming from Copenhagen. And there we already have 500 million of our own funds. Because when your country is going underwater, you can't wait for somebody else to come and give you money. You have to try to survive yourself. So this fund was created in 2009, 500 million for 850 projects, all of which are climate adaptation and resilience. We need to focus on climate resilience and how to build more climate resilience for climate vulnerables. And that fund, we have, this time at COP28, we have presented a national plan for adaptation, and it requires, every year we are spending $3 billion for climate adaptation and resilience, and also mitigation, but more focus is on adaptation because our carbon footprint is very less. But we need every year 8.5 billion. So we are short of 5.5 billion. And the global goals for adaptation and COP28, that's also very important. We're happy that there was a framework for global goals for adaptation. And it says that adaptation fund, each year, it will require 40 billion additional fundings. So where does it come from? So we need to focus on fundings. If you look at the Green Climate Fund, it has got 12.5 billion because it focuses on mitigation. But when it comes to LDC fund, it has only got additional pledges of about 180 million. It is so less. When it comes to loss and damage, it's got 770. So The funds for LDCs, the Special Climate Change Fund for developing countries and vulnerable countries, these are receiving much less funding than those on mitigation. The focus is so much on mitigation. But adaptation, you have set a net zero, and I want to thank Mission Zero Coalition for inviting me. But we have set a net zero for emissions. What about the net zero for adaptation? How much adaptation can we do? And for that, we need huge amounts of funding. So financing new innovative mechanisms and consensus on financing is very important, because we know that multilateral financial system is very difficult to restructure it. But what about new innovative? And I know that Net Zero Bankers was here. But there's so many philanthropies in Bangladesh. We are. I also want to say that few things that needs to happen between between now and COP29 and COP30 is we have to look into partnerships, and partnerships for example, my friend from Azerbaijan said that technologies. We cannot afford technologies. Bangladesh is a densely populated country. Every single acre has to be arable for agriculture. We need to ensure our food security. So where do we go? We go offshore. Offshore technologies are very, very expensive, and we don't have the means. So financing technology transfer and capacity building for climate vulnerable and developing countries, LDC says, is extremely important. So I'll stop here, but one more thing I want to add. We have, as a country that faces natural disasters every year, cyclones and floods, we have set up our own mechanisms for climate resilience. And we are doing nature-based solutions, and I think nature-based solutions is extremely important, something that should be looked into in COP29 and COP28. And if we can have a day dedicated to nature-based solutions, I'd be very happy. For us, we have a traditional floating agriculture. You can grow everything on a bed of water hyacinth. And that Bangladesh is doing it's a traditional system, and we are doing it in the coastal areas. The other one is we have invented salinity resilient rice varieties and drought resilient rice varieties. We have now developed flood resilient rice varieties. These are the things that we should be talking about in terms of adaptation and climate resilience. So I hope that COP29 and COP28, and congratulations to Azerbaijan, how two countries can unite for preventing climate change. This is an excellent example. We deserve a huge applaud for that. We should give him one. So at the end, one more thing, I would like to say that, developing country, if you look at the Commonwealth, and Mr. Goldsmith is here, former Minister for Commonwealth, we have 2.4 billion people in the Commonwealth. And, 65% of those people are young people. And I think he spoke about the youth. Somebody was speaking about the youth voices. We need to have at least one youth conference, before the COP29 or maybe at the sidelines of the COP. But our young people, our coastal youth have prepared a coastal youth network. And that network is so strong. They are the voices of the local communities and the youth leaders. They know exactly what's going on in their fields, in the agricultural sector, in the shrimp cultivation. Their voice is very strong. And I'm talking about gender as well, being the president of the Women in Diplomacy Network in London. We organize climate events, climate change, and we believe that women are most affected by climate change. I know that the professor has been to Bangladesh, Helen, and in Bangladesh, in coastal areas, there's so much salinity, there's no fresh drinking water. And women and young girls have to walk like 10 miles sometimes, or 5 miles to get water. And our Prime Minister is building this, the entire coastal areas, we have 7 million solar home systems, and it's the highest in the world. So individual houses, she's encouraged people to take this, there's an ITCOL company, it's government owned, and they provide very subsidized price solar home systems for coastal areas which are cut off from the mainland. And they're also providing women with free deep tube wells so that they don't have to walk. And every girls' school is situated around those deep tube wells. So these are innovative things that we want to build our climate resilience against, but women's participation and women's voices are very important. Now we need to look at COP28, how many women were there, and how many, all these health risks for women. When a cyclone happens, they're the ones, and they lose their household and poultry, and they're the ones who have to rebuild. So one issue that Bangladesh has brought in COP28 and will continue to at COP26 is that the mental health impact of climate change and the natural disasters. So mental health, when people lose their homes, the entire homes are just washed away. And when there's a flood, they lose everything, they actually break down mentally. So, loss and damage should include that mental health impact of or aspect of climate change. So I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
That was so interesting. I could listen to you all evening. That was so interesting. I'll come back to you to ask a little bit about loss and damage, because the Mayor of Freetown, Yvonne, was talking about, oh, it's all well and good, the loss and damage, but who pays it, who gets it, and how much for each person and so on. So looking to the future, maybe you will have some solutions for us there. But you were put on the spot there a little bit, Zach, about the Commonwealth and what government are doing. So I wonder if you want to give us a sort of overview of how you see the outcomes for COP moving forward into those solutions, and as we've heard, that innovation.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'm going to try not to, because so many good things have already been said, but I'm going to start by saying thank you to Chris for inviting me and for all the great work you've done in Parliament. So I'm going to do a shortcut is that I agree with everything that was just said around finance, and I hope we have a chance to talk a little bit more about that. I don't think the numbers are huge, they're overwhelming, but there are practical steps that we can take if politicians decide to take them to close that gap. It is possible. We have all the tools we need. It's a matter of political will. So I hope we'll be able to come back to some of that in a second. But I want to focus on the penultimate point that Her Excellency made, and that was around nature-based solutions. Because COP is a flawed process. We know that. And we've heard a lot about that in the last few days. But it is the only process we have that can bring the world together. It's the only thing that gives us any hope of being able to move in tandem internationally, globally. One of the main flaws, I think, with the COP process, until recently, still today, but less so, is that it's been incredibly narrow. It focuses almost exclusively on carbon, on the energy transition, on clean tech. And the problem with that is that it misses the bulk of the story, which is nature. There is no net zero. There is no solution to climate change without nature. It doesn't matter how many solar panels you put up. It doesn't matter how much energy efficiency, how many barriers and how many wind turbines. If you lose the Congo, if you lose the Amazon, if you lose the forests of Indonesia, if you lose the mangroves, which have provided protection, as you've spoken beautifully about this in the past, I've heard you, we're finished. It's game over. You know, about a quarter of emissions, probably a third of emissions, come from bad land use. And the flip side is that healthy forests absorb a lot of CO2. So it is insane, I think, that nature has always been so distant and so remote, so ancillary to the main discussions in COP. We tried to change that in Glasgow. We brought nature into the heart of this discussion, but we had to focus it a bit, and we focused on forests and mangroves. Nature is obviously a lot more than forests and mangroves, and we secured a pledge that, if delivered, if honoured, would, I think there is enough there that we would see the end of deforestation and the beginning of a reversal by the end of this decade. But there's a big if there, because as with all these things, there's a huge gap between promise and delivery. And that's a point I'm going to come back to in a second. But we are today looking at a world that is being environmentally shredded. And I'm not going to depress the audience too much. You probably are aware of the figures, but just to put it in context, we're losing every single minute around 30 football pitches worth of forest. I mean, it is staggering. I've used that figure before, and sometimes I find myself saying it without really thinking about it. But if you stop and actually consider what that means, it is devastating. We've lost around 2/3 of the world's wetlands. When I say lost, they're degraded to the point of not being able to provide the function that they're supposed to provide. 15 of the world's 17 great fisheries have either been brought, killed off, they've become dead zones, or they're on the brink of collapse. And it just goes on and on and on. And there is a simple truth, and that is that we do not exist except as part of the global environment. We see the end of the global environment, we see deterioration of key ecological systems on which each and every one of us depend. These discussions about carbon become completely absurd. So my concern is that as we go forward, and I say this taking advantage of the fact that we've got the next COP president, maybe the next COP president, certainly a representative of the next host of COP, is that we need to make nature front and center of this COP, next COP, and every subsequent COP. We cannot divide these issues up any further. The good news is that in terms of the energy transition, there is an inevitability about it. Whatever politicians do, we are going to go through this transition. We are going to end up with clean tech. We are going to have cars that are electric. They may not be cheap enough yet, but they were a lot cheaper now than they were 5 years ago, and a lot more efficient too. You know, today in every country in Africa, solar panels are the cheapest form of energy without any subsidies at all. I couldn't have said that to you 4 years ago. We were told in the UK that offshore wind we'd have to wait till 2043 was the official number in bays, or whatever bays used to be called, before it hit parity. It required no subsidies. In fact, we're at that point right now. Chris will have the best figures, but I think it's this year or next year. Technology's defied every single prediction, every single expectation. Even under President Trump, who spent billions of public money, taxpayers' money, trying to prop up the coal sector, weirdly, coal's nevertheless declined faster and further on his watch than it had under Obama. So we think we're all powerful politicians. The reality is the market is way more powerful than anything politicians come up with. But none of that is true when it comes to nature. So that's why we need government intervention to turn the tide, to help begin the process of reconciling ourselves with the natural world. And if you consider that only a tiny percent of funding, of aid money or philanthropic money goes towards dealing with climate change, only about 2% of that money goes towards nature. It really doesn't make any sense at all. And it's not just about climate change. Congo Basin, which we're losing at about 1 million hectares every year. Just imagine the consequences if those trends are allowed to continue. When we know that the Congo Basin, that one basin, provides more than half of all the rainfall across the entire continent of Africa. So you imagine the humanitarian disaster that is inevitable if we don't stop those trends from happening. That's the Congo Basin. Similar story in relation to the Amazon, similar story in relation to the forests of Indonesia, and so on and so forth. So this has to be the priority. And the final point I'll make is that we actually have all the promises that we need. If every promise that's been made in successive COPs, including the biodiversity COPs, was honoured, we'd be okay. We'd be having a very different discussion on this panel to the one we're having at the moment. And we have all the international apparatus. We had Paris, the big overarching goal. We had Glasgow, the Glasgow Leaders Declaration, which brought nature in. We had Montreal last year with the Global Biodiversity Framework, which sets the world theoretically on a path to recovery. 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the world's land and sea by the end of this decade. You know, we've got commitment from the World Trade Organization to phase out harmful fisheries subsidies. We've got commitments around, just a few days ago, around land use subsidies. All this stuff is there. But, you know, great, let's have more promises. That's wonderful, and I'm sure we'll get more promises in Azerbaijan as well. But way more important than more promises and more grandstanding by governments is we just bloody well do what we said we're already going to do. Because if we do, we'll be on a path to recovery. So that has to be the focus in my view. I realise I went all over the place and I didn't begin to answer your question. And I spoke for too long. I would love to speak more, but I'm going to stop and see where the discussion takes us.
And I think that challenge is the promises have to be delivered in something tangible. But it all feels a bit too big and maybe overwhelming, and sometimes that's where local leaders can come in.
Absolutely
So,
right.
for example, the commitment with the South Yorkshire Mayor, Oliver Coppard, for a white rose forest.
Yeah.
And where businesses and homes are being washed away in Hebden Bridge, we have initiatives for slow the flow, upstream water. So there are, I know sometimes it just feels so overwhelmingly massive, breaking it down into interventions that can be done now, today.
So I'm going to make one point, only because I think I spoke for a tiny bit less than my neighbour.
You
So
did.
give me 20 seconds. Is that actually the good news is that every single thing that needs to be done is already being done. There's nothing, there's no gap. There's no area where we need to be managed. I'm looking at our friend from Costa Rica here. Costa Rica is an incredible example. They've broken the link between agricultural commodities and deforestation. Commodities are responsible for 80% of global deforestation. So if every country does what Costa Rica has done, we've got pretty much taken a bite out of the bulk of the deforestation problem. You've got Indonesia broke the link between palm oil and deforestation. Very, very nearly broke the link at least. I mean, it's a way more successful story than I think they get credit for. You've got the Maldives. I think we have a representative here from the Maldives. Their tuna fishery is inherently sustainable. You can only use one line, one hook. More people are employed. When you buy tuna from the Maldives, you're part of the solution, not the problem. Gabon has broken the link between logging and deforestation. I didn't even think that was possible, but it is possible, just by banning the export of raw timber. So everything has to be processed and built in Gabon, which means you've got more highly skilled jobs, 10 times more people employed in logging, 10 times fewer trees being cut down. I've walked through forests that have been logged twice in Gabon, and I'm surrounded by forest gorillas and forest elephants and higher levels of biodiversity than I thought possible. It is possible, and that is true in every part of the world. There is a part of the solution. The difficulty is that it's not all happening under one umbrella in each and every country, and those examples of best practice are just that. They're not the norm. But we have everything we need to make them the norm. So it is very, very possible.
That's really hopeful. That's the focus of this session as well, is the future and solutions and how we can carry on the passion and the energy between COPs as well.
Yeah.
So that was quite a lot to take in, Helen. Do you want to just make a few comments about what you've heard so far?
Yeah, I'm glad everyone else has rambled actually, because that gives me sort of license to,
You're allowed, everyone is
to go
allowed
everywhere.
to ramble.
No, I really liked Zach's end on solutions, because I'm a big believer that there's more positive, there's more positive to get out of climate change than there is negative, and also the focus on doing, which I think fundamentally, basically there's you should always know where a stat comes from, shouldn't you? But there's a stat that I taught my students, which was that of the NDCs we have, only 44% of them actually have a plan associated with them. So for me, I 100% agree. It's about what we do with the plans we have, not new, fine, let's be more ambitious once we've done what we said we were going to do with the plans that we have. So I'm not a great believer in the UNFCCC as a process. I think it serves a purpose to bring everyone together. Do solutions to climate change have to be global? No, I don't think they do. And there's a lot of work about, in some senses, climate change means so many different things to so many different people that the solutions have to be local, they have to be embedded. Trying to get a global solution, in some senses, holding us back. So they always have to carry on in tandem. You need all the countries of the world there speaking about this, but do you need a sort of universalist solution? Probably not, right? It's going to be localized, it's going to be based on our cultures and our priorities. So I think I'm a climate migration scholar, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about migration, because I think, funnily enough, the UNFCCC is a space where multilateral discussions, I've got a PhD student who works on this, so I'm stealing her ideas here, as we like to do as academics, just bask in the reflected glory of our PhD students. But, this idea that actually a lot of the multilateral work on climate-related migration is happening in the UNFCCC, which is weird, right? It's not happening in the IOM, it's not happening, Paris is, France has got the presidency of the Global Forum on Migration and Development at the moment. They're prioritizing climate, but actually in the UNFCCC there's a lot going on. But under this kind of area, we talk a lot about what needs to be done for net zero. We're not meeting our plans. We have to meet our NDCs. Everywhere there's a skills gap. So across the board, in every country of the world, there's a skills gap for net zero. And we're not talking about how we're going to fill that gap. We are, but we're probably not reacting on it. And we need to train up our own populations. We need to reskill our own populations. We need to have that pipeline of people coming through that can use this tech. But that's going to take too long, right? We need immigration, right? And again, this is a big part of transitioning to net zero we're not talking about, which is that we need different immigration systems, because countries UK cannot meet its net zero commitments without increased migration of skilled workers. We don't even have the visa systems required, because we don't know what those future jobs 100% are going to be, because we don't really know how this net zero, how this sector, this green sector is going to explode. And so I think we really need to start talking about, we are talking about skills, but I think we need to start talking seriously about migration systems that allow us to meet the net zero challenge within our countries. And that's something I've sort of been thinking about quite a lot recently. I think something else that's come up with the whole of the last discussion about finance, and I've never argued that the governments can meet everything, and we have a discussion before the chat about the role of the private sector, that this funding has to come from the private sector. But the IPCC, I'm an IPCC author, I worked on Working Group 2 and this year and this round. And for the first time, the IPCC kind of recognized the role of colonial legacies in driving vulnerability. And so vulnerability, you're not going to reduce vulnerability in countries by countries giving a few $1 million here and a few $1 million there. It relates, as a colleague talked about, restructuring the kind of global financial system, restructuring, this idea of stopping debt when a disaster comes. Well, why not just stop the debt, So I think there's a limit to how much gifts from one country to another can actually reduce vulnerability in those countries, and I think we have to keep talking about that, as there needs to be a change in the way the whole of the global society is structured for us to be able to live well under climate change. And that was something that came out in the IPCC, the role of these historical legacies. One thing I will just talk about as a kind of thing I think we should be talking about more, which is about transboundary and cascading risks, I think, as well, which tie us together as countries. So, it's easy for us to think about adapting in our own countries, but not only are emissions transboundary, so is risk. And it's increasingly we're understanding how risk cascades across borders through our supply chains, through our interconnected economies. And so we can't really just focus on those countries needing to adapt and us not needing to adapt, because their risks are our risks. But also, even saying that, for example, the UK the adaptation gap is huge, and you think, actually, what do we need to see? Okay, maybe if we're not reducing emissions, fine, but let's take adaptation seriously, and let's start thinking about the solutions that we can put in place to adapt, because even the UK, which you might think is a more resilient country, isn't going to meet the challenge of climate change in terms of impacts. Our infrastructure, our people aren't ready. So I think it's about, I'm not sure what the point there is, readiness of our own countries, but also understanding that our risk is everybody else's risk, and we're increasingly understanding that. So I think, one more point I'll end on.
Sure.
One more point, everyone else does.
Yeah, go
Zach
for
had
it.
an extra point. 1.5 degrees, I think as well, the focus on the line weirds me out a bit. It's an arbitrary line that we've made for dangerous climate change, which has a legacy around how we used to model climate change and how it became this political force. And I think it's something that we've rallied around, but every increment of a degree matters. And I think sometimes the focus on the 1.5 leads, you think, we've exceeded it now, it's over. And it doesn't matter. If we can get to 1.51 or 1.52, that's better than, we don't cross that line, it's the end. And I think sometimes that obsession with the 1.5 line, I think, detracts from the fact that every fraction of a degree matters.
I think also your point about skills is really important, because as a local leader, having responsibility for adult education budget, 65 million, one of my manifesto pledges was 1,000 green jobs for young people, and set up a green jobs task force. We're over 1,107, which is pleasing, but also I've got to get buy-in from potentially a new government. And so the Labour government are talking about 28 billion for their Green New Deal. My argument would be, well, then if we are going to level up and also tackle the climate emergency, then spend that money in areas that are historically manufacturing, but also it's an opportunity for skills training and well-paid jobs and just transition. So I do think that is a particularly important point, that we will never be able to get there without that knowledge transfer and that skill. So just building on what we were saying about the future and something that Zach was really offering, which is solutions. And this is an exam question for everyone, what do we think might be, or what would we hope would be the breakthrough when we get to Azerbaijan? Maybe I will start with you.
I will
okay,
ask
all
my
right,
co-host
so while
to go
everybody
first.
thinks about the exam question and the answer, what would be the hope? We have all so many ambitions. We've seen, haven't we, that this time that the phasing out of fossil fuels has been seen as very positive, whilst not going far enough. Has been a celebratory moment for some, and a step in the right direction. Have you any thoughts of what you would think, it would be a great COP if we could just get this?
So I'm going to, as we heard from His Excellency, that when you've got the whole world having to agree something, you're always going to have something which is suboptimal. That is just a fact of COP. But some of the really good things that happen at COP don't necessarily happen in the big forums. So I'm guaranteeing that 90% of the audience did not hear that a few days ago in COP in Dubai, all of the countries of the South Pacific, all the small island states in the Pacific, bar one, signed up to a commitment, to protect an area of ocean connected that is bigger than the surface area of the moon. Now, how many people knew that?
Wow.
Look at no hands going up at all. I mean, where the hell were our useless newspapers? Where was the BBC? Where was Sky? Where were any of these bloody... I don't know how many journalists there are here, but if you're a journalist here interested in climate change, why did you not write about that? How many people would have been enthused and happy to hear that this great thing had been agreed with money? Real political commitment and money. And that's just one example. So I would like to see, I'd like to see our bloody newspapers and journalists actually talking about, not just looking for the petty dramas and squabbling, but actually telling the truth, telling the stories, giving those young people who are so depressed, rightly so by where we are, that there are some good things happening. Let's celebrate them, for God's sake. A lot of work went into creating that thing. Not one line in the British press, not one bloody line. Maybe in other countries they're a bit more interested, but I don't think so. And there are other examples like that as well. What I would like to see between now and Azerbaijan is I would like to see something similar agreed around the great basins, the great biomes, the Congo, the Amazon, Indonesia. Political appetite is there. We've had some helpful elections like President Lula in Brazil. There's an election coming up in Indonesia, but it looks like it's going to be a continuity of some sort, and the current minister's really ambitious for their forests. In the Congo, different countries, but coming together with something that looks like a consensus there. I would love to see big, grand coalitions of country, donor country, philanthropists, private sector coming together to help provide a solution to some of these gigantic problems. That would be pretty good. I'd love to see more buy-in for things like the mangrove breakthrough, which you're part of. Bangladesh has been so good, by the way, on this. And your personal leadership has been superb. I would actually like to see us crack the nut that you challenged us with earlier around finance. You know, we talk about 700 billion needed for nature recovery, but we're not going to come up, governments aren't going to provide 700 billion. But if you consider that the top 50 food-producing countries in the world spend $500 to $700 billion every single year subsidizing often destructive land use, imagine the impact if you shifted away from destruction towards renewal. You'd have closed that gap there and then with just one policy. I know it's not that simple, but there are countries doing it actually. It's one area where I think the UK is showing leadership. We are transforming our land use subsidy system. So there are many ways we can do this. Debt, I totally agree with you on the debt issue, but there are some interesting things happening with debt. Ecuador, you know, our friend Gustavo Manrique from Ecuador restructured a part of Ecuador's debt and effectively created a $1.4 billion endowment out of nothing, just by lowering the cost of the debt, a part of the debt Ecuador had working with America. No new money introduced, didn't cost anything. $1.4 billion endowment, which is now paying for the conservation promises of the last Ecuador government. Belize has done something very similar. Seychelles have got their blue bond. Fiji have got their blue bond. There are some really interesting things happening out there. It feels to me that if we could get the big multilateral development banks, which are moving but at a glacial pace into the right place, we will start freeing up a lot more of the finance that we currently need. At the moment, then they have to be pushed and pushed and pushed. I know this from Glasgow. You are soon going to discover this. Moving the MDBs is very, very difficult, but they need to be moved, and they need to create much easier access to finance, particularly for the climate vulnerable nations, but also for some of these more innovative solutions.
What's the carrot then on their finance?
Well, on the MDBs, I think it's us. I think we are, we are one of the biggest investors in the multilateral system. We are therefore a shareholder. We could have a much more muscular approach. This is something I was always saying when I was a minister in government. I wish the UK were more muscular. We shouldn't just tell the World Bank we're going to pay every year, whatever, no conditions attached. We should make our contributions conditional. If you're not going to open up finance to the small island states that we are friends of and meant to be supporting in the Pacific region, or half of the Commonwealth countries as climate vulnerable nations, we're going to at least reduce our contributions to the World Bank. If France and Germany and Norway and other countries did the same thing, those multilateral development banks can respond. We know they can respond. The Global Environment Fund came under a lot of criticism 3 years ago for being too bureaucratic, too slow, too difficult. A country would ask for money and it would take 5 years, and by then the need had gone. They are now the most responsive and the most agile. I always come back to Costa Rica, but it's our friend Carlos Manuel, former environment minister from Costa Rica, was put in charge of the GEF. He has transformed it. It now looks like an agile multilateral development institution which provides money very quickly to the front line, to the best organizations. If other multilateral organizations behaved in a similar manner, again, we'd be having a different discussion now. So this is not rocket science. We know you don't have to be imaginative, even or clever. You just take the stuff that works and roll it out.
That's definitely something for the agenda moving forward.
Sorry,
it's fine. No, it's very good. You're passing to each other, His Excellency.
I'm glad that I yielded some of my time to Goldsmith. I think it's a very positive agenda. I think, of course, as we all know, the issue of financing and finding the ways to support the action. If we can, I don't know if we can resolve it in Azerbaijan. I think it's probably more for Brazil to finalize it, to put to seal. But if we can make a meaningful progress in Azerbaijan towards this, I think that's very important. And there's something Lord Goldsmith spoke about, and it's made me think about this, and we will be trying to work on this, is to put, I think, two things front, and which is very important for us. One is, of course, the issue of nature itself, because Azerbaijan is a very diverse, it's a very small place, but it's very diverse. We have 9 out of 11 possible climate zones. They all mingled and intermingled, so it's very important for us. But also the success stories. You spoke about Costa Rica, you spoke about Indonesia, Mauritius, you spoke about Gabon, and I think one thing which is missing is that we don't showcase them enough. Yeah. I think because people, look, there is a certain mentality around the world. If people come in and they look like Americans did that and the British did it, they're like, okay, can we do it? But if they see that it's been done in Indonesia, it's been done in Costa Rica, it's been done in Gabon, they say, well, we can do it too. Why don't we try to do that? And I think highlighting those successes, I think we'll try to do this. I think that would be a very good approach. And for us, for instance, one thing we're kind of careful to talk about because it requires us a regional partnership as well. It's a shrinking nature of the Caspian Sea. I mean, Caspian Sea is a unique body of water. It produces the only real caviar. Most of the caviar which you eat is not real because it doesn't come from the Caspian. But you know, but the population is decreasing and the water is shrinking. So I think it would require us to have a regional partnership, regional action because the 5 nations which border the sea. But also we understand how important and as you said, whatever you do in terms of carbon, once the sea goes away, we have the opposite problem with you. Your Excellency, you have our water goes to you, I guess. I mean, we're losing water. So I think this is something we need to look at. Her Excellency mentioned something that we need a regional approach, and I think that's and the partnerships. I think that's very important because, as the professor pointed out, I mean, you can't control where the wind goes, where the pollution goes, and for us, I think the very fact that the nations of Eastern and Central Europe supported Azerbaijan's candidacy. It was also, we understand and we appreciate, with a certain hope and putting a responsibility on us to act and speak for all of them, not just for Azerbaijan, not just for big issues, but for our neighbors and for our region. And that's partly reflected in our agreement and understanding with Armenia that we also want them to live in a cleaner world. I think that's also important. And I want to join something that Ambassador said here. I think we need to look at a global complex issue. It's a more peaceful world, a greener world, but also a more equal world. I think the issue of immeasurably more greater damage done by environmental pollution and degradation onto women and to vulnerable groups in general should be taken into account because we often don't look at it in the way we should be looking at. And I think you're absolutely right. I think we should also look at this to bring the issue of equality within that conversation as well, because without that, a clean world which is not equal, I mean, it's good but not good enough.
Indeed, indeed. I've just caught the time. I can't believe the time has rattled away with us. And I do want to get a couple of questions from the very distinguished audience. So I wonder if we could just very quickly answer the exam question about what we hope to see for next COP, and then I will open it up to the audience. I wonder, Helen, would you want to kick us off?
I can try and keep it short. I think I want to come back to something that actually that Vijay said in the last panel. He didn't call it climate resilient development pathways, but that's what we would call it under the IPCC, which is pathways that link adaptation and mitigation together. And I think they're in two separate camps and they're not joined enough. There's no point building new infrastructure for the net zero transition if it's not climate resilient, right? There's no point doing adaptation if you're not thinking about, okay, is this increasing emissions or lowering emissions? So I think a bringing together of the adaptation and mitigation agendas, because when you're making a decision on the ground, they're not separate, are they? If you're investing in a piece of infrastructure or you're investing in agriculture or whatever. So I think that would be something. I think, going back to what Zach was saying about the media, I often think about the fact that there's so many businesses going to COP, and often it's presented as a kind of greenwashing thing, right? Mm-hmm. But it's actually a great thing that all these businesses are going to COP because they want to know how to, they're involved. I want to know how to do this. And so I suppose, how do we stop having these two COPs? There's the COP of the negotiations and then there's the COP of the big jamboree. And can they be brought together somehow? Or do you know what I mean? And how can we maybe make more of the jamboree in a sense for the businesses that are there? Mm-hmm. And finally, something I often write about is the climate change is an opportunity thing that's come up, and how, again, people who are skeptical and cynical are like, well, that's a greenwashing thing. You're just business as usual with a bit of good in it. But fundamentally, some of these things are really shifting things for the better in society, not just with climate change. And how do you keep giving people that hope rather than that fear, I think. And actually, to come back to your point about the climate anxiety, which is there, which is real, which is... So, I think, yes, how do we keep building on a solutions focus without it being business as usual and greenwashing?
So business welcome. That's a really good point. Thank you. Yes, Ambassador.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to remind everyone, Bangladesh is hosting 1.1 million Rohingya refugees, which has gone to 1.3 now. And this, not only climatically displaced people, but refugees coming from, and they settled, we had to rehabilitate them in Cox's Bazar. That is the most climatically vulnerable region for Bangladesh. And there comes that, this, you talked about climate migrants, I'm talking about climate refugees and other refugees. So, at the COP28, Bangladesh's negotiator, our Prime Minister has appointed Special Envoy Sabir Chowdhury, and he mentioned about CBRD and CP. The question of equity is very important. When LDCs were talking about CBRD and CP to be kept in the adaptation or the loss and damage, the developed countries were fighting it. So, at the end of the day, climate change is an opportunity, and it should be a zero-sum game. What you're investing today is going to pay back in the future. So in terms of, I want to mention that at the sidelines of the COP29, we'd like to see an ESG and talk about private sector. Just yesterday, we organized at the Parliament, Bangladesh is the second largest ready-made garment producer. And our apparel industry is transforming to an ESG regime. And where the British consumers, we had Marks and Spencer, Primark, New Look, and other British fashion, retailers there, and everybody is working on sustainable cotton, sustainable recycling, less energy efficiency, having more solar on the factory. So I think private sector's ESG should be a focus of the COP29. And if you could organize an ESG day to show the private sector should be showcasing, there should be a competition created within them to show their ESG. Therefore, automatically they'll focus on cutting down emissions. The other one is, Zach, thanks for mentioning mangrove. At the COP28, there was a global mangrove alliance that was created, and we congratulate UE for doing that. And mangrove is something, it's a carbon sink. Not only does it make coastal resilience, but it also is the largest carbon sink for Bangladesh and India. And we are the largest delta in the world, and we are the foothills of the Himalayas. So, speaking of ecosystems and conserving ecosystems, the largest delta should be also the Bay of Bengal. And here I want to talk about leadership. Leadership is very important. Which leader and which presidents and prime ministers are focusing and giving top priority to climate change? And here I want to commend Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. She came up at COP21 during our CVF. All the countries in the CVF have adopted a climate prosperity partnership. That means the Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan. We are talking about transforming our vulnerability to resilience, transferring our resilience to prosperity. Bangladesh has been the highest growth country in South Asia for the last nearly, a decade. And to sustain a high growth rate with climate prosperity is the challenge. And that is where we need to invest. So we want to see a climate prosperity concept. So when we were chair of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, we encouraged every CVF member to adopt a climate prosperity plan. That means how you can sustain your growth rate, yet not compromise on climate. It's a very difficult balancing act, but you have to try to do it. And nature-based solutions is very important for that. And therefore, in COP28 or COP29 or COP30, we'd like to see showcasing of what countries are doing. So we should be having an climate innovation day, climate resilience innovation day, where we showcase what we are doing. It can be a good way of learning from each other and also South-South cooperation. And one more point I would like to make, quite often developed countries who have been the biggest polluters, they think they're doing us a charity. Now I want to look at my SIDS friends. You're doing us no charity. You've actually polluted the world and caused us not to exist. So, in terms of the least they can do is, I talked about the Santiago Network, which is going to be, housed at the UNDRR at the UN. The Santiago Network is working on technical a capacity building to discuss even loss and damage. People don't understand that what losses, I'm talking about the common people, the agricultural, the farmers, the people who are dealing with Sundarbans, for example, the honey collectors of Sundarbans. They need to be told that there is a way you can enhance your skills. And this is what I'm saying. If you're talking about green skills, how to actually operate, utilize the loss and damage fund, people need skills on that. So in COP29, we'd like to see, now that we have a loss and damage fund, and a mechanism for access to fund, we'd like to see the San Diego network given much more important and working with the loss and damage fund, perhaps the World Bank, but no one agreed with it. Everybody thought it should go to the Caribbean Bank of Development. That should be the headquarters of the, the loss and damage fund. But it is the World Bank, and we have to decide how do we actually build skills amongst our people. We can enable our scientists to decide how to utilize the loss and damage fund. So there are funds, but also utilization is very important. One more thing I'd like to mention is 2 cases that are going on. Bangladesh will continue to see climate justice to be a very important issue. I know the developed countries, they always get scared, when we talk about funds and financing. But at the same time, there are 2 cases that submitted, one by the Small States Commission at the ITLOS, where we are asking the UNCLOS Convention's application on whether it is legal for developed countries to just pollute and cause the sea level to rise, and whether it is legal to do so. And the other case has been submitted by Bangladesh and Vanuatu at the International Court of Justice, where, again, we want to see the application of international law on climate change and global sea level rise, whether a country or a group of countries can cause other group of countries to go underwater. So climate justice and the morality of it is extremely important. So we have to apply ethics, and we'd like to see something at COP29 so we can take leadership on that. And last
Her Excellency, I'm so sorry. I have been given the signal that I know that people are wanting to.
Sorry about that.
It's all right. This is so interesting. People are wanting to circulate and to chat as well. And I have been a terrible host because I've let the time run away with us. But it's been so interesting, and ending on climate justice, I think, is a very good end and something maybe to take away as we look forward to the next COP. Thank you all so much for attending and for being such a great audience and showing such interest. It's been fantastic and fascinating, and thank you all so much. And there's obviously opportunity for chatting later. Thank you.
I'd like to also say thank you again to the panel for remarkable discussions and fascinating insights. I'm sure you'll all agree. We're now going to move through to the next room, where we're going to have an evening reception. I'm delighted that we're going to be joined by the Shadow Secretary of State for Net Zero and Energy Security, the Right Honourable Diplomat, who will give another keynote address. And I understand that there are some sort of remarkable views of the capital out on the outdoor terrace as well. This day actually marks a year to the day where I submitted the Net Zero review to the UK government, which then sort of inspired the Mission Zero sort of coalition. That review is available for anyone to take away at the back, so do please pick up your copy. This has been a fantastic opportunity to reflect on the outcomes of COP28, to discuss the priorities for COP29 and COP30. And for me personally, one of the key recommendations in the global stocktake text was actually a mission 1.5 degrees framework that all 3 presidencies are now going to work on. And if any of the countries here are inspired to go away and think about your future national return and contributions, any help that we can give either at KCL or the Mission Zero Coalition, we're keen to do so to help provide that opportunity to recognise that climate change and action on climate is both an opportunity as well as obviously a moment to address the climate crisis. So look forward for everyone to come through to the room. Please do pick up a drink on your way and also a copy of the Mission Zero book if you haven't already. And look forward to the keynote address that will begin around 6:30. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you. We look forward to seeing you in Azerbaijan.
It's great to see you here. Yeah, thank you.